Good evening. I was about to say, I think I unmuted that thing, but sometimes I get confused and mute it, but I can hear it. So it's a good thing about being down here. When I'm up there, I'm like, am I on the pulpit mic or this one? If I can get my PowerPoint pulled up here. Debated on what I wanted to study tonight because let's see, this is the 14th, there's the 21st. I just heard from, I talked to him, what's today, Sunday? Friday, I guess it was. The days are running together from the past week or so. But on Friday of last week, I talked to David, and we were talking about getting everything set for him to join us. He's going to make a short visit to some family in Costa Rica when I go down there, Lord willing. And he told me that he's going to have some days off in the next couple weeks or so. And I was kind of laughing about that. I said, well, I reckon they've kind of gone soft since I was there. It was a lot harder back when I was in school there. But fourth quarter, you didn't get any time off until graduation, which happens mid to late June. But they have, I think he said they call it May days or something like that. And so he's got a few days. And he said on the 28th of May, he's preaching somewhere in Mississippi, and then he's going to head this way and wants to come and visit a little bit. And he said, this was also kind of humorous to me because the last time he was here for a few days before he went to Memphis, I asked him, I said, David, do you want to preach? And he said, oh, I don't know. And he said, maybe just something very, very short. And so he did. And part of that I know was the biggest thing was he was not super comfortable with English. But he told me, when we were talking Friday, he said, I'll be there Sunday morning, but I'll be there in time. I can preach. And I said, oh, okay. I said, so you're willing to preach? And he said, yes, if it's okay. And I said, well, I mean, they don't want to put too much on you. If you're preaching that morning, you may be tired. He said, no, it'll be fine. So I told him, I said, well, let me get with the elders. So Jimmy, Chris, and Martin, here you go. But we'll follow up. But I said, let me get with them. But I said, I imagine they probably would love to hear you, see how you've grown in your studies and so on. But I told him I'd let him know. But if he does end up preaching on the 28th that evening, then that leaves me with just tonight and next Sunday night for the month of May. And I want to get a Science in the Bible in at some point. So tonight I decided just to go ahead. I can't just put it off forever. So I want to go ahead and start with some of these questions and answers on this series that we've been doing on leadership. Some questions and answers pertaining to elders, deacons, really this entire series. Don't forget, if you have some of those, I have, 3 or 4 that were submitted to me. I think all the ones that I have so far have come from one person. Other people have asked me a few questions, so if you're thinking, wondering if yours are in, others have asked me a question or two, but they were already in what I had. Some of these will come, in fact, all the ones tonight, I believe, come from Brother Roger Campbell's material that he put together, just some questions to go along with this. I will mention a little bit about my previous week doing the gospel meeting in Bridgeport, but I'll get to that in just a moment. I want to look at just a few questions, and we'll see how many of these we have time to get to. But questions that people might ask. This one pertaining to someone not selected. So the question is, if a brother is, and I think from talking to Joshua this morning, over here gets me more away from the PowerPoint, right? Is that right? If I have to stand to the side, it may not matter when I'm on the floor anyways, but Joshua told me this morning, he said you kept standing and you were getting covered by the PowerPoint from where you were standing. So if a brother's not qualified to serve as an elder or a deacon for that matter, or maybe his name is put forth or he's considered by the elders if there are already elders there, but he's not selected to serve, should he feel ashamed? I hope we all understand and know the answer to this question. The answer, of course, is no. You do not have to serve as an elder to go to heaven. You do not have to serve as a deacon in order to go to heaven. Those are, wonderful things, but it's not something that you have to do in order to go to heaven. Whether you're an elder or deacon or not, there are some things that we could observe. In fact, you want to turn over to John 15. Really, a lot of different passages we could go to, but just a couple here for the sake of emphasis. John 15. This is the pretty well-known passage where Jesus talks about, I'm the vine, ye are the branches, speaking, of course, to his apostles there. I point this out a lot. Some of John 14, 15, and 16 is applicable only to the apostles. You've got to look at that really closely in context. But there are some things in those 3 chapters that, by extension, apply to us. This is one of those, where Jesus is the vine and we, Christians, are the branches. But every branch that beareth not fruit, he taketh away. Every branch that beareth fruit, he purgeth it. It's in verse 2, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now ye are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can ye, except ye abide in me. He says, I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit, for without me ye can do nothing. If a man abide not in me, he is cast forth as a branch and is withered, and men gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. If ye abide in me, and my words abide in you, ye shall ask what you will, and it shall be done unto you. Herein is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit, so shall you be my disciples. So, we could say, whether you're an elder or deacon or not, God expects you to bear fruit. Can I do that if I'm not serving as an elder? Or as a deacon either, for that matter? Well, sure. There are all kinds of ways to bear fruit for the Lord and for his glory. So I could do that, and God expects that. God expects all of us, whether we're elders, deacons, or not, to be good and faithful servants. Right? There's the judgment scene that is depicted in Matthew 25. Isn't that what he says? Well done, thou good and faithful servant. So that's what he expects of us. And I would remind us all that Jesus himself did not serve as an elder or as a deacon in the church. And so if the potential is there to maybe one day be an elder, maybe one day be a deacon, maybe there's potential but you're not quite there. Maybe here's a situation where the elders are considering someone, but they say, well, it's just not quite right. Maybe the timing is not right. Maybe there's something missing in the qualifications. Well, how do I handle that? I would encourage us, if their potential is there, keep growing. Keep preparing yourself to maybe someday serve in that capacity. I'll also say this, and I've seen it in various situations. I don't know if I've ever actually been in a congregation when it happened, but I think it is fair to say that oftentimes a person's response to non-selection is pretty telling. I can't recall being in a congregation where it happened, or I'm trying to think. I'm pretty sure I've been in congregations where we had maybe somebody that wasn't selected. I've never been in a situation where it went negatively, let me put it that way. But I've talked to those who have, I've heard from those who have, and sometimes a man that maybe a good portion of the congregation felt was qualified, but he's not selected, and all of a sudden just comes unglued. And I told one brother one time, was talking to me about a situation, and I said, please tell me someone, they had some kind of meeting, and the fellow was just ugly in the meeting. And I said, please tell me somebody in that meeting stood up and said, brother, and this right here is why we know we made the right decision. I don't remember if he said they did or not, but sometimes that's very telling. I've told y'all before, it was a story Brother Leroy Dedman told me one time of a man selected to be an elder. There were no objections. And on the day when he was to be appointed, somebody came on that day. There had been ample opportunity given to present a scriptural objection, and nobody objected. On the day he was to be appointed, had family members there. Everybody's excited to see their relative appointed as an elder. And somebody came up with a silly quibble about why he shouldn't be appointed as an elder. And so someone approached him. And it was almost like everybody's kind of on pins and needles, like, how is this going to go? And said, look, maybe we need to talk to him. Maybe we need to get over here, call these folks into a side room. And I don't remember all the details, but the brother basically said, look, it's fine. Just don't worry about it. If somebody has a problem, don't appoint me. It's not a big deal. Some of the family members that had come were upset. He told them, it's fine. A little bit of time passed. The brother later was appointed and served many years faithfully as an elder. You see why I say many times a person's response to not being selected, or even sometimes a last-minute quibble that may be kind of ridiculous, and this one was. It was pretty ridiculous, the problem that someone had on that particular day, that they had 2 or 3 weeks previously to voice. But this fellow said, just don't worry about it. We're not going to cause a problem. We're not going to cause division. Hey, that's a fellow that, that's why he went on to serve so well as an elder, because that's the kind of attitude that's needed. Maybe you are qualified and somebody overlooked you, or maybe you feel like I'm qualified but they didn't select me. I don't really understand why. Hey, it's not some kind of a popularity contest. It's not some type of if I'm not selected, it's been a slight against me in some way. Maybe there is potential there. Keep developing it. If not, what's the old expression that people sometimes say? In fact, we hear this a lot, kind of in a motivational setting. Bloom where you're planted. I don't have to be an elder to bloom and bring forth fruit for the Lord. I don't have to be a deacon to bloom and bring forth fruit for the Lord. Just bloom where you're planted. Sometimes people get so worked up about these things when we need to just serve God. So, bottom line here, though, should a person feel ashamed? No, in no way. There is no shame in serving the Lord in whatever capacity. We should all be so thankful, grateful to be in the Lord's kingdom, period. Next question here. What if the same brother's name gets submitted to serve both as an elder and a deacon? I've definitely never been in a situation where this happened, but it could happen. Maybe here's a congregation that's never had elders and deacons, and so they say, we feel like we have men qualified for both positions in the church. And so what we want people to do is, you may recall when we talked about appointing elders, we talked about appointing deacons and how there's not really like a specific plan laid out in the New Testament. And so some people do it one way, some people do it another. As long as we are finding men who meet the qualifications and giving a chance for someone to voice a scriptural objection, then there's a lot of expediency and, how it's carried out. But a lot of times people will do that. They'll say, submit names, especially when there aren't currently elders or deacons. Maybe submit names. Who do you think is qualified to serve as an elder? Who do you think is qualified to serve as a deacon? We'll meet with those people. It may be that you sit down, you may start out with, 5 names of men potentially to serve as elders. 2 of them may say, hey, look, I don't desire the work. They may say, I don't feel personally like I'm qualified. I'm not even prepared to take on that kind of responsibility. I mean, that is a huge responsibility to answer for people's souls. No way. I'm not ready for that. Okay, well, scratch his name off the list, because that is one of the qualifications, right? But even with deacons, there may be somebody that otherwise is qualified, but here's a guy that says, hey, look, I'm just too busy with work. I'm too busy with my family. I got too much going on, period, in my life right now. There's no way I could do this. and do it right. So I appreciate it, but no, I'm not willing to serve at this time. Okay, well, scratch him off the list. So, you maybe start out with 5 of each. Now you got 4 and 4. And then there's a time period. Is there any objection? Can anybody think of any reason why they're not qualified? That people may have a reason. And then, of course, you got to work through that. But sometimes I've heard of maybe once or twice where a man's name was submitted by one person. Well, I think here's a fellow that's qualified to be a shepherd, an elder. But the same name was submitted by somebody else as, well, I think he's qualified to be a deacon. And maybe he's qualified to do both. What about that? Well, it's impossible to serve in both positions because if you recall from previous lessons, deacons serve under the oversight of the elders. Well, I don't know how you serve under your own oversight, but it would be impossible to fulfill both of those positions together. But it may be that he's qualified to serve in both of those capacities. There are, kind of some common sense considerations. He may desire one, but not the other. Desire does matter, 1 Timothy 3:1, especially when it comes to serving as an elder. Maybe he's willing to serve as one, but not the other. He might be qualified to serve as both, but say, hey, look, I'm perfectly willing to serve the church as a deacon, a special servant, if that's a need. But again, maybe he says this idea of, giving an account for souls that's heavy stuff, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that. So I'm not ready to serve as an elder. Just not quite there. Maybe I will be someday, maybe not, I don't know, but for right now I'm just going to have to say no to that. Well, that's nothing sinful about that. There might be a greater need for one over the other. I submit to you, probably, most likely, if a man is truly qualified to serve as an elder and he has that desire to do so, then probably that's the most expedient choice because that's the greater responsibility. And sometimes finding people that meet those qualifications can sometimes be more difficult to do. And, sometimes it's difficult to find deacons, people qualified to meet those qualifications as well. So I don't know if I'd say one is necessarily more difficult than the other, but if I had to pick one, probably I'd say the elder's qualifications. That may be expedient, that may not. But really the point of this question, I think, was just, well, what if a person gets submitted for both? It's impossible to serve in both capacities, folks. So you're going to have to pick one or the other. Or, again, sometimes the fellow may not be willing to serve in either, or may somehow be, not be qualified to serve in one or the other or both. But if he's qualified for both, probably the most expedient would be to serve as an elder, but not necessarily so. Again, there's going to be situation to situation you have to determine. All right, let's go to the next question here. So does a man have to be a deacon first before he can serve as an elder? The answer here is no, of course not. There is nothing in the Bible that teaches this. Sometimes it almost becomes unspoken among some people that deacons are like junior elders or that they're like elders in training or something. And that's not the case. That's not what the Bible teaches. There's nothing in the Bible that teaches this idea. It may be that a deacon serves a long time and he never develops the qualifications to serve as an elder for whatever reason. He may, for one thing, as we've already talked about, he may never desire it. He might never reach that point where he could be said to be apt to teach. He could still serve as a deacon, a special servant in that capacity, but he wouldn't be qualified to serve as an elder. Maybe he doesn't have faithful children. But a man might, even though he never serves as a deacon, possess the qualifications to be an elder. I don't know, I'm trying to think if I've ever had a conversation with somebody. I know I've heard of it, but I don't know if I've ever personally had a conversation with somebody, but I've heard of sentiments expressed something to the effect of, well, they just put him right into the eldership. Like, either upset or at the very least confused, like, I don't understand. I mean, they just bypassed deacon and went straight to elder. Like, it's unheard of. That's not what the Bible teaches. It's not like a series of, sequential steps. There are qualifications that are given. Well, but, maybe somebody thinks, well, Chad, how does somebody just all of a sudden, boom, he's qualified? Well, I know he's not just boom and he's qualified. However, maybe you have a congregation that's never had elders before, and now they're appointing elders for the first time. Well, do they first have to have deacons, and then they pay their dues there in the deaconship and move into... Again, these ideas, not only are they unscriptural, they unnecessarily and unscripturally demean these offices as if one's a stepping stone into the other, as if there's some kind of a hierarchy. It really especially demeans the work of a deacon. And deacons that serve faithfully, that's a great work. But, it almost becomes, well, you just be a deacon over here, and you just, don't worry. You bide your time. Maybe you'll get to move up. Well, my Lord says if you want to be the greatest in the kingdom, be a servant. Matthew 20:25 through 28. Well, that's what a deacon is, diakonos, servant. Maybe they're appointing elders for the first time. And so here's a man that if he's qualified, he's appointed as an elder. Maybe he's just been noticed by the congregation. He may have had the qualifications for some time, but for whatever reason, maybe the congregation just hasn't had another qualified man. We talked about that when we talked about elders. You can't have just one. Nowhere in the New Testament do you read of just one. So maybe they've only had him, and he just maybe hasn't been noticed because of that, or maybe there was another fellow that everybody had their eye on for a long time, and this other brother just kind of quietly develops his character and develops his life and becomes qualified, and all of a sudden one day somebody's like, oh, hey, what about brother so-and-so? And they start to ask some questions and do some research, and hey, sure enough, he's qualified. So that could happen. It may be that he's been a Christian for some time, but he's newer to the congregation. Maybe he didn't grow up here and, hasn't been here 100 years, but sometimes people move. I've known of, in fact, especially when I was with the church up in the St. Louis area, just across the river in Illinois, there was, I just went blank on that. There's an Air Force base, Scott Air Force Base, out east and south, I believe, of that area of Illinois. And so a lot of times people were coming into the area. Sometimes they would come in and move out before too long. But sometimes some of these guys were coming in and they were getting close to their 20 years in the Air Force, and sometimes they would retire and they'd put down roots in that area. And what we found was that sometimes, in fact, when I came in, there was a fella that he'd been there for a little bit, and now in his situation, he had, I think he served as a deacon for a time. But he was, even when I was there, he'd only been at the congregation for just 4 or 5 years. But he developed his spirituality and his character and his maturity, and ended up being qualified to serve as an elder, even though he hadn't been in that congregation terribly long. Now, you got to be there long enough to know the flogs. That's part of being an elder, and we understand that. But somebody may be newer to a congregation. Sometimes somebody comes in, they place membership. It's all kind of different things. But bottom line, there are qualifications given for elders. Either we meet them or we don't. But it's not if you meet them, then you're appointed a deacon, and after you serve at least X number of months, years, whatever, then you can become. No, that's not what God says. God says, if a man desires the office of a bishop, an elder, shepherd, he desires good work. Here are the qualifications. And so if you meet those, you're qualified. If you don't, well, you're not. Next question here is dealing with deaconesses. You may notice I didn't deal with this, at least I don't recall dealing with this when we covered it. We're talking about deacons. But sometimes people ask a question about deaconesses. And is it scriptural for women? And really this is asked primarily when it comes to deacons. I don't know if I've ever heard it asked as much so with elders, but I have heard of some even congregations that wear the name church of, belonging to Jesus Christ, that would have eldresses. But especially with deacons, this question gets asked. Is it scriptural? Well, it's not scriptural in either case. And really, there's one, we know why, just as plain as day, because 1 Timothy 3:2 and 3:12 says one of the qualifications of a deacon, one of the qualifications of an elder is to be the husband of one wife. Well, I mean that, let me say it like this. If we respect the authority of God's word, that ends all discussion on that. But I know sometimes people say, what about Romans 16, verse 1? You may want to look at that. You may already know Romans 16:1. It's a lady named Phoebe. And it mentions her there. And we'll read the exact wording of it if I can get to Romans 16. Paul says, I commend unto you Phoebe, our sister, which is a servant of the church, which is at Cenchrea. Well, somebody says, I know, I looked just very quickly. I found the RSV, the American Standard Version is kind of our country's version, the American version or the U.S. version of the RSV. They're very similar in many respects. I think the ASV's a lot stronger in many areas than the RSV, but the RSV is one that I found that says, it refers to Phoebe, our sister, which is a deaconess of the church at Cenchrea. There are no doubt other versions that have it that way as well. Even the ESV. I'm not, I'll be the first to tell you whether we're talking King James, New King James, ESV, there are no perfect translations. Sometimes these translators take liberties that they shouldn't. There are certainly enough. That's one of the value of having a number of translations, by the way. You can compare and contrast, and God has blessed us with that so that we can see. We have all these thousands upon thousands of manuscripts, so we can go back and check and see, what does it say? Does it say, is there anything there that would indicate she's a deaconess? Because I need to know this. There's not. It just says she's a diakonos. Well, it just sounds like deacon, Chad. Well, it's the word that means servant. And I won't go and repreach what we talked about when we talked about deacons. But what about it? Even the ESV has a footnote there. It's translated, she's a servant. But the footnote says, or deaconess. Well, there's no way that could possibly be the case scripturally, because Phoebe was a servant, diakonos. Government officials are also diakonos. Well, are we prepared to start calling them deacons in the Lord's church? The police officer that patrols the streets, he may or may not be a very moral person at all. He's one of our deacons. Should we put him on the letterhead? Government officials, Congress, Senate. Whew. It's getting. Better watch out there. Are we prepared to call them deacons in the body of Christ? Well, no, Chad, don't be ridiculous. They're not qualified to be deacons. Well, same thing with Phoebe. She did not meet the qualifications. Well, Chad, how do you know what qualifications she met? I don't. But I know one qualification she didn't meet. Husband of one wife. And sometimes I've seen people, preachers even, go round and round with this. Was Phoebe a deaconess? Folks, she didn't meet that qualification. That alone rules it out. Was she a servant? Absolutely. And apparently she was a very faithful servant. As such, she's not going to overstep her bound and try to get into something that she knows is beyond the scope of God's role for the woman. Whatever serving she did it in the realm of not usurping authority or teaching over man from 1 Timothy 2. And so that question does come up. But certainly whatever Phoebe did as a servant of the church at Cenchrea, it was not outside the realm of the authority of God's Word? And so that's a pretty cut and dry question, even though sometimes it gets debated pretty hotly among some folks. Now, that said, I want to, as we kind of wind down, I want to look at something that I wanted to share with you anyways, and we'll use this to kind of segue into the invitation tonight. I've been listening to a debate. Garland Elkins, one of my former instructors at the Memphis School of Preaching, and Brother Elkins is just very dear to me. I did not even realize he had held a public debate. I should have known this, and I'm sure I probably was told and just had forgotten it. But the man's name was Bob Ross, a member of the Baptist Church, and the debate centered around baptism. Is baptism a part of becoming a Christian? And Brother Elkins affirmed that it is in the first night or two of the debate. I forget how many, I think it was 2 nights. And then Mr. Ross, in the latter 2 nights, affirmed that salvation is just by faith alone and does not involve baptism. And of course, Brother Elkins denied that proposition. But it's been a very good debate so far. But one of the things that was of interest to me is Brother Elkins, in his opening speech, when he's affirming baptism is a part of a person becoming a Christian. He went to Mark 16:16. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. And he talked about believeth and is baptized, or what you call in the Greek grammar aorist participles. And he says whenever you have aorist participles, the main action, the main verb is always subsequent. It always comes after. And so believeth, aorist participle, is baptized, aorist participle, saved. So they have to come before the main verb. So before a person is saved, he believes and he's baptized. Sometimes people will take that and they'll say, well, you need to believe and you'll be saved, and then later on you need to be baptized. And most people, especially folks, I tell people, I grew up, all my family, Baptist, Methodist, even some what Grandmother Campbell called hard shell Baptist, the primitive Baptist. That was not an ugly name. That was a name that many times they would refer to themselves, but it was just another way of saying primitive Baptist. I don't know any of those groups. Most religious groups don't say, oh, no, don't be baptized. They just say you're saved and then go and get baptized. But what Brother Elkins was showing is that's not possible, that's what Jesus was saying. There's a way to say that in the Greek, to say, okay, one can happen and then saved, or the other could happen and then saved. But no, he says, believeth and is baptized. He showed that. In fact, he quotes from A.T. Robertson, who ironically was a Baptist scholar, and Ray Summers, also, if I'm not mistaken, was a Baptist scholar. It was kind of funny because Mr. Ross got up afterward. He says, well, I don't know why we need to bring Greek into this. I don't know if a lot of people here even understand Greek. I'm not sure we should, all this talk about Summers and Robertson and all this. I don't really see the point. And well, then Brother Elkins got up later and said, well, here's what you said in one of your, and he quotes from a tract or a debate or maybe both, and showed how that fellow was bringing up Summers and Robertson and the Greek and all that. And he says, well, either it's important or it's not. And the bottom line is the New Testament was written in Greek. All that's just to say this. I think, and I don't know, only Bob Ross was his name. Isn't that the painter's name too, Bob Ross? This was not the painter, but I was thinking about that, and I was like, isn't that guy's name? So he painted quite a picture in this debate, but it wasn't necessarily the prettiest picture. Anyways, I don't know. Only he knows and the Lord if this was why. But it certainly seemed like because he could not answer the argument. He really never dealt with the Mark 16:16 argument. In fact, he mocked Garland Elkins a few different times for saying, well, I've been in a lot of debates with you Church of Christ preachers, and I've never in my life seen one that just come and present one little scripture. One little scripture. He didn't go to 1 Peter 3:21. He didn't go to Acts 22:16. He didn't go to Acts 2:38. Just this one scripture. And Brother Elkins just kept saying, if you'll answer it, we'll move on. Just deal with it. And then we can move on to something else. But he wouldn't. And in one speech, he got up and he went on and on and on, Mr. Ross did, about what he calls Campbellites. Maybe you've heard that name before. Oh, Alexander Campbell started your little group, and he just went on and on and on about this, about how he gave some dates and stuff, and he fancies himself quite an expert on Campbellism. Well, I had the opportunity last week, while I was in Bridgeport for this meeting, to go to visit a place. Well, this is up from the mountain, the view. They took me after, I got my pictures out of order a little bit, after we went to do this other stuff. This was the preacher, Danny Rader's his name, and Randy Smith, one of the elders. They took me to a restaurant called Top of the Rock. Well, it's Top of the Rock, all right. It's way on up there in the foothills of the Appalachians, but man, it's a pretty good view from up there. There's another view from that on the way. That's Tennessee River over there. I believe that's right. But here we went to the Rocky Springs Church of Christ building. It's actually only about 5 minutes from the Bridgeport building. And this is significant. It's the oldest Church of Christ in Alabama. I was thinking that they were not currently meeting. There actually are still some people who meet there. It's a pretty small congregation. But we went there. You can see, here's a picture of the auditorium. This is not the original building. I thought at first it's a very old building, and you could tell when you go in there. You can just tell by the pictures even. It's a very old building, but it's not the original by a long shot. In fact, he said 2 or 3 different buildings have burned over the years. But, and there's an artist rendering of, I think that's one of the older buildings. I believe that's one of the ones that burned. And honey, I don't know. I meant to ask you. I don't know if any of those are your, what'd I do? I don't know if any of those are your people. I know you got some Becks on your mom's side of the family, I believe. But it says in memory of Dad, James T. Beck Sr., Mom, Helen, or I believe that is Beck. But that's one of their old buildings that's no longer standing. There's their little fellowship pavilion. That also is pretty old, but not original to the church. But you know, when they used to talk about, they used to say quite often, dinner on the grounds. And that's many times what they mean by that. That sometimes they go out. Sometimes they didn't even have a pavilion. It'd literally be dinner on the ground. You'd spread it on the ground, blankets and such. And there's their cemetery. I didn't get to go up there because the brethren didn't have time, and they're probably glad they didn't take me up there because they might never have gotten me out of there because I like history, and I would have been looking at graves and years on graves from now till, from then, probably until now even. But anyway, some old graves. In fact, they said there are a number of graves over there you just can't. It's just impossible to read because they're so old. There's a magnolia tree that has one or two graves, they said, just completely entwined in its roots. It's just so old. It's pretty fascinating stuff. I think there's another one. No, there's not. I'll leave that up. But this congregation goes back to 1807. And that is significant because Alexander Campbell had not even come to America at that point. Nor had his father, Thomas Campbell, even come to America. And Brother Randy told me, he's apparently like I am, and he's kind of into history, but he's been reading a lot of documents and things like that he's been able to get his hands on. This church, they were, let me go back here, I'll leave you on this one. This church was he called it something, I was trying to remember the term he used, union something, he said. And essentially what that means is, and I know you guys have to pull up the invitation song, so I'll go ahead and blank that. What that means was, on any given Sunday, you had preachers. You remember, most of us are familiar with the term circuit riding preachers. Well, one Sunday it might be a Baptist preacher who was riding into town to preach. The next Sunday it might be a Methodist preacher. The next Sunday it might be Presbyterian. The next Sunday, and it was just, there was a circuit of them that come through. And he said there was something that in his research, he noticed, and from talking to people that maybe remember talking to grandma or grandpa way back in the day, a number of them, in fact, the vast majority of them, were drinkers. They would drink alcohol. In fact, he said it was not uncommon. They'd have a little, almost like a cup holder on the pulpit so they could set their liquor right there. And he said it got to the point where many times they would show up on Sunday to preach drunk. Or by the time they were halfway into their sermon, they were good and liquored up and drunk. And the brethren started getting fed up. And some of the men got together and said, why do we need a bunch of drunks coming in here? And sometimes they talk such nonsense because they're liquored up. Somebody says, well, I mean, we don't have anybody ordained. Somebody else says, I don't read anything about being ordained in my New Testament. I just read that you need to be preaching the Word. Well, I guess we could do that. And so they started swapping up among the men. And before long, they said, you know what? We don't read about this denomination, that denomination. What we read about in the Bible, in the New Testament, is the Lord's church. And they were looking at Romans 16:16. They said, churches of Christ salute you. Well, churches of Christ salute you, that we're one congregation. Why do we not go by Rocky Springs, Alabama, Church of Christ? And down the road a little bit, they had men qualified, and they appointed them as elders. And so, folks, when we extend heaven's invitation, maybe somebody's not a member of the Church of Christ. I'm not asking you, I'm not even recommending that you leave your denomination to come over here to mine. And that's what sometimes people hear when you talk to them about these matters. Oh, you think your denomination is so much better, and man, how arrogant. Well, let me tell you something, that would be pretty arrogant if that's how I thought. But I can assure you that's not how I think, because that's not how the Bible puts it. In the Bible, there are Christians and there are not. Non-Christians, in other words. I'm either a Christian or I'm not. There are not Baptist Christians and Church of Christ Christians and Methodist Christians and whatever. And, well, I think my group is so much better. You should just be a part of our group. No. Jesus is better. So as we wind up this evening, I was so privileged to see that, and that was so encouraging to me, because I don't want to be a Church of Christer. I want to be a Baptist. I don't want to be a Methodist, Catholic, Presbyterian. I just want to be a Christian. And I can be, and you can too. Are you a Christian tonight? If not, it's a simple process. You believe with all your heart Jesus is the Christ, surrender your will to His, confess Him as Lord, and be immersed in water. Your sins will be washed away, and you're raised up out of the watery grave to walk in newness of life. Have you done that and you're not where you need to be spiritually? Or maybe you need prayers for strength, for encouragement. Maybe you need to study it further. Maybe you say, I'm not sure I agree with that. I'm not gonna just take your word for it, Chad. Please don't. Well, let's talk about it. Search the scriptures, and if I can help you with that, I would love to. Nothing would thrill me more than to sit down with you and study God's Word. Let's be just Christians. Nothing more, nothing less, nothing else. Can we help you with that? If so, come on, we stand and sing to encourage you.
There's a fountain free.